Something is happening in Las Vegas that most people have not fully registered yet. Not the national media, not the analysts updating their preseason rankings, not even a significant portion of the fan base that has spent the better part of a decade watching this organization lurch from one identity crisis to the next. But if you slow down and actually look at what is being constructed inside that Raiders facility right now, not the headlines, not the hot takes, the actual structural decisions being made at every level of the roster, you start to see something that this franchise has not had in a very long time. A coherent direction, a plan that extends beyond the next few months and actually reflects an organizational philosophy about how you build something that lasts. And right at the center of all of it sits the most genuinely fascinating quarterback room in the entire NFL this summer. Let me start with Fernando Mendoza, because nothing in this conversation makes sense without him at the foundation of it. Number 1 overall pick. By every account filtering out of that facility, a person who is almost physically incapable of mentally leaving the football field, even when he is required by circumstance to be somewhere else. There is a detail from the NFL rookie premiere that has stayed with me since I first heard it. Most rookies walk into that event and feel the full weight of having arrived. The cameras, the merchandise shoot, the recognition that you have reached the stage you spent your entire life chasing. Fernando Mendoza was visibly frustrated to be there, not ungrateful, not unaware of what the moment represented. Frustrated because every hour in front of cameras was an hour away from the practice field, away from the playbook, away from the mechanical work that he already understands separates good quarterbacks from the ones who define an era. He wanted reps. He was genuinely annoyed that circumstances were preventing him from getting reps. And when I heard that, something crystallized for me, because that specific brand of obsession, the kind that makes a person resent any obligation that pulls him off the field, is not a teachable quality. Nobody installs it. It is either present in someone or it is not. In Mendoza, it is clearly present in abundance. But here is where I need to slow down, because the honest conversation about this situation is more layered than most people want to engage with. Talent and obsessive drive are necessary conditions for developing into a great NFL quarterback. They are not sufficient ones on their own. And the question the Raiders front office is genuinely wrestling with is not whether Fernando Mendoza eventually becomes the franchise cornerstone they selected him to be. Everyone in that building believes he will. The actual question is whether accelerating his timeline to Week 1 against Miami, then the Chargers in Week 2, actually serves the long-term version of the player they invested everything in. When I sit with that question honestly, rather than defaulting to the instinct that says always play your best player, the answer starts moving in a direction that takes most people by surprise. Look at that early schedule with real attention. Those are not the kind of opponents that ease a rookie quarterback into professional football. Those are teams whose defensive coordinators have spent the entire offseason reverse engineering every mechanical tendency in Mendoza's college tape, designing pressure packages specifically calibrated to disrupt a young player's rhythm before he has had any chance to establish one. And quarterback confidence at the professional level is a genuinely fragile thing in a way that does not have a clean parallel in other sports. A young point guard who struggles early gets reset opportunities quickly because the game moves fast and the next possession is right there. A rookie quarterback who gets exposed in consecutive nationally visible games carries that experience in a different and more permanent way. It does not just become a result, it becomes the first chapter of his professional identity, written in public, before he has had any say in how that story begins. And once a narrative hardens around a young quarterback, the work required to reverse it is brutal even when the underlying talent was never actually in question. That is the structural logic behind Kirk Cousins being in this quarterback room. And I think most people's instinctive pushback against it is missing what he actually provides to this specific situation. Yes, the Raiders just drafted a player they believe is a generational talent at the position. Yes, starting a veteran in his mid-30s ahead of him feels counterintuitive at the surface level. But Cousins does not just bring the ability to win football games while Mendoza develops, which itself has significant value. He brings something more specific and more immediately useful. He already knows this offensive system. He has operated under this coaching structure before. The terminology, the concepts, the precise timing of when the ball is supposed to leave the quarterback's hand, the way this staff wants routes to develop relative to the defender's leverage, all of that lives inside Kirk Cousins already. That familiarity means the offense can function at a real level from the first week of the regular season, before the surrounding pieces have had time to find their cohesion. And those surrounding pieces are more unsettled than the conversation has acknowledged. The offensive line has Tyler Linderbaum as a legitimate anchor and real potential around him, but the other 4 spots carry genuine uncertainty as camp opens. People discuss offensive lines as collections of individual assignments running in parallel, but that description fundamentally misunderstands what a functional unit actually is. A functional offensive line is one organism, 5 players whose understanding of each other's tendencies is deep enough that adjustments happen automatically, without spoken communication, because the familiarity has been built to the point where responses are instinctive rather than calculated. That level of cohesion requires time under real conditions. It requires training camp and preseason, and the early weeks of a regular season where consequences are genuine. Placing Fernando Mendoza behind a line that is still in the process of becoming itself is not protecting your investment. It is exposing your investment to conditions that are not fair to him and that could shape his professional identity in ways that serve no one's long-term interests. Kirk Cousins starting the opening stretch gives that line the time it needs. It gives the receivers time to identify their roles within this scheme. And it gives Fernando Mendoza something that is genuinely undervalued as a development tool for young quarterbacks: the opportunity to process live game speed from the sideline without being responsible for the outcome in real time. When you are on the field, your processing is necessarily reactive. You are managing pressure and coverage rotations and protection adjustments all simultaneously, with no available bandwidth for the broader observational learning that happens when you can watch the game unfold from a remove. Done correctly, that sideline education does not put Mendoza behind schedule. It accelerates his preparation in ways that simply would not be available to him if he were out there in survival mode against a defensive coordinator who has done nothing but study his college tape for 6 months. Aiden O'Connell belongs in this conversation, and I want to give him a fair accounting rather than a footnote. He has thrown 3 touchdowns in a recent session. He carries himself with genuine composure. He knows this franchise more intimately than anyone else in that room. He was part of the 63-point game against the Chargers, which is a performance that does not disappear from a locker room's memory. He has real capability that shows up in the right circumstances. But the Raiders did not allocate $30 million toward veteran quarterback play and the #1 overall pick in the same offseason to hand the starting role to the player who was already on the roster before either of those moves happened. The math does not work that way, and everyone in that building knows it. O'Connell's most meaningful contribution to this specific situation is not as the answer to the quarterback question. It is as the mechanism that keeps the competition genuine. His presence pushes both Mendoza and Cousins to earn what they get rather than inheriting it. If his performance in camp is strong enough to create real trade interest around the league, the Raiders potentially extract a late pick for a player who was unlikely to find a defined role on their final roster. That is a quiet organizational win, not a failure. Now, I want to spend real time on the receiver room because the prevailing narrative around it is almost completely wrong. And I find myself getting genuinely frustrated by how consistently the actual context gets left out of the conversation. The rankings have it near the bottom of the league. The takes call for splashy acquisitions, recognizable names, someone to be the clear top option that an offense gets built around. And I understand why the view from the outside produces that anxiety. Looking at the roster in isolation, without the context of what those players were actually operating inside last season, the concern appears reasonable. But the context is everything, and stripping it away produces an analysis that is not just incomplete, but actively misleading. Every evaluation of these receivers last season was conducted inside an offensive environment that was genuinely broken. Quarterback play was inconsistent in ways that prevented routes from developing on the correct timing. The offensive line could not sustain protection long enough for the deeper passing concepts to function as designed. The scheme did not create the spacing and structural leverage that young receivers require to demonstrate what they are capable of at the professional level. Evaluating a receiver under those conditions tells you about the conditions. It tells you almost nothing reliable about the receiver. And now those same players are entering a new season with a functioning quarterback, a more coherent offensive line, and a coaching staff that actually knows how to design an environment in which skilled players can succeed. The transformation in how this group looks when the circumstances are not actively working against them could be dramatic, and I think it will surprise people who locked in their assessments based on what they saw last year. Trey Tucker is a name I keep returning to with genuine conviction, and not exclusively because of the speed, though the speed is legitimately extraordinary by any measurement. The deeper issue is that the Raiders have persistently failed to deploy him in ways that leverage what actually makes him dangerous. A receiver who can run past any defensive back in the league on any given snap, being used predominantly on crossing routes, routes and short concepts underneath the coverage is a chess piece being played at a fraction of its actual value. The threat Tucker creates when he is allowed to attack vertically does not just produce explosive plays on the occasions when the coverage breaks. It restructures how an entire defense has to align. Safeties cannot cheat down. Corners have to respect the deep ball on every snap. Linebackers cannot shade toward the run without creating vulnerabilities in space. The entire field opens, and every other receiver on the roster operates with more room as a direct consequence of what Tucker demands from the secondary. If Clint Kubiak's staff actually deploys him to threaten vertically the way his skill set warrants, the outside perception of this receiver group will shift noticeably and quickly. Jalen Nailor is another piece of this that deserves more attention than it gets. The physical profile he brings to this group is genuinely distinct. Standing next to Tucker, the size contrast is almost jarring. Two completely different body types representing completely different skill profiles and coverage problems. Nailor was buried in Minnesota, which sounds damning until you understand that getting buried in a depth chart is one of the most common and least informative things that happens to talented football players. Scheme fit, roster circumstances, coaching preference, injury timing. There are 100 reasons a capable player can disappear behind the starters that have nothing to do with his actual ability. What matters is whether the talent shows up when opportunities arrive. With Nailor, it did. Players who perform when given limited chances tend to perform even more emphatically when given consistent ones. Jack Besh is the receiver I come back to with the most personal conviction. Second-round pick, versatile enough to align across multiple spots, legitimate size, and an entire rookie season spent inside an offensive context so dysfunctional that drawing conclusions from his production numbers would be like judging a driver by his finishing position in a race where the road was half missing. The Raiders used real draft capital on him. The organization believes in the player. Everything filtering out of OT. As about his work, has carried the kind of quiet enthusiasm that tends to precede genuine breakout seasons when the surrounding conditions finally click into place. Second-year receivers who spent their rookie campaigns in broken offensive environments have a history of surprising people significantly when the infrastructure around them stabilizes. I will be genuinely surprised if Besh is not among the stories people are discussing when this offense finds its rhythm. But every conversation about this receiving group eventually arrives at the same place, and the most clarifying thing I can say about this entire offensive unit is simply, Brock Bowers is the offense. That is not a diminishment of anyone else in that building. It is an acknowledgement of reality. Bowers may be the best tight end in professional football right now, and what that means for every other skill player on this roster is structural. Defenses have to dedicate resources to stopping him that cannot simultaneously be dedicated to covering everyone else. When a tight end commands the coverage attention Bowers demands, slot defenders get pulled into alignments they are not comfortable in. Linebackers get pushed into coverage assignments that expose them in space, and safeties are forced into choices where every option has a real cost. The windows that open for other receivers as a direct result of Bowers demanding attention are not secondary opportunities. They are the design product of an offense built around knowing exactly what it has at that position. So when people ask me whether Las Vegas needs to go outside and acquire a prominent receiver before this season begins, my honest answer is that the need is significantly less urgent than the conventional wisdom suggests, and possibly absent entirely. The conversation about pursuing A.J. Brown does not interest me, and not primarily for production or contract reasons. A player who has demonstrated a pattern of visible dissatisfaction, who carries a reputation for friction inside organizations, is precisely the wrong kind of addition for a team with a first-year head coach, a developing offensive line, and a young quarterback who needs a room pulling in a single unified direction. The Raiders do not need a talent transplant at this moment. They need chemistry. They need a group of players who trust the process being laid out and commit to figuring out how to win together. That kind of cohesion is fragile in its early stages, and introducing a personality that has complicated locker rooms before is a risk this organization has no reason to accept. The broader picture, the thing I genuinely want you to sit with, is that what is being assembled in Las Vegas reflects a different kind of organizational thinking than this franchise has demonstrated in recent memory. This is not another desperate swing at relevance. It is not expensive talent layered over structural dysfunction and presented as a solution. This appears to be a front office that has genuinely identified what it wants to build and has chosen to build it in the correct sequence, rather than the fastest one. The Mendoza development philosophy, the Cousins bridge, the receiver room approach, the offensive line construction process, each individual decision points toward an organization that has decided patience in service of something durable is worth more than acceleration in service of immediate optics. If Cousins plays well, wins football games, keeps the Raiders competitive while the pieces around Mendoza continue to develop, and if that moment arrives, perhaps in October or November, where the staff looks at the situation and decides the time is right, the environment for Fernando Mendoza steps into as a starter will be unrecognizable from what Week 1 would have offered him. The line will have become a real unit. The receivers will understand their identities within the scheme. The system will be running on instinct rather than conscious construction. And Mendoza will take that first snap as a starter, having absorbed hundreds of live game reps from the sideline, having watched pressure packages and coverage rotations and fourth quarter situations from a vantage point that allowed for genuine learning rather than pure survival. There is one thing worth noting as a final thought, because it carries a kind of storytelling weight that I find genuinely compelling. The Raiders and the Titans are on the schedule late in the regular season. The Titans took Cam Ward first overall in the same draft Las Vegas used on Fernando Mendoza. If both quarterbacks are starting by the time that game arrives, if both have developed through their respective situations and earned the right to operate their offenses, you have something rare on your hands. Two #1 overall picks from the same class, shaped by different organizational philosophies, meeting late in the year with potential playoff stakes attached. That is not just a football game. That is the kind of matchup the sport produces once in a generation. And the foundation being built in Las Vegas right now, quietly and without the fanfare that tends to accompany genuine progress in this league, is exactly the kind of foundation that puts a franchise in position to be relevant when that game arrives and for a long time after it.